Guys are comfortable talking about a whole lot of stuff. Cars, you got kids, weather, old standby, sports. If you're me, you have books and Bravo shows. Not for everyone, but I love them. Mental health, though, does not rank super high on the list of chattable topics for most guys. But let's say you know 10 men. One of them likely experienced serious depression this year. One of them battled substance use disorder. That's according to government data collected by the mental health group Heads Up Guys. And then you have all the run-of-the-mill stressors and pressures that impact everyday life. Dr. Jett Stone is a clinical psychologist who specializes in reaching men exactly where they are. He's the author of the book, Quiet Your Mind, A Men's Guide. He's a columnist for Psychology Today. Jett has some really unique insights about the struggles, but also the hopes of boys and men. Jett Stone, welcome to All Boy.
Great to be here.
Jett, tell me, how did you come to clinical psychology and I guess more specifically, treating men?
Yes, so there's the personal, there's the professional route. I grew up in what I would call like hyper-masculine environments. The locker rooms of the Midwest, I was an ice hockey player, and I saw these representations of men that were, strong, sturdy, overbearing, intense, intimidating to me. And I think just from an early age, that environment made me curious, like, who were these people? So I was, a young athlete, but I was also a very artistic person. My mother's whole side of the family were only artists. So I'd come home from hockey practice and like write poetry, right? Or play music. And so there was kind of a conflict between these hard-nosed endeavors and these more artistic endeavors. And I felt this frustration that these models of masculinity and manhood seemed unreachable to me. And that includes my father too, as well. He was more of a cool, calm, collected brand of masculinity. And I just wanted more, right? So we start there, right? As a starting point for me. And then as I go to school, I'm an English major, right? And so that major at the University of Michigan is mainly full of females, and that's great. And I learned so much. And then I go into psychology later on, and then that also has started to tilt more female. So I'm this guy, heavily. We'll talk more about that later, maybe. But so I'm this guy among women, and it's, I'm starting to wonder, why aren't more men interested in, let's say, the humanities or reading? And at that point, my mom was like, you should study psychology. And because she said that, I didn't. I made sure not to take even a psychology course. And so I came to psychology later. I was interning actually for Psychology Today, the pop psychology magazine, and helping build out their blog network, for which I would later become an expert contributor. Yeah. And so I got a chance to just talk to tons of different experts in mental health, calling them, trying to do due diligence and get information and help my editors out with stuff. And I just talked to a lot of psychologists, basically. And that inspired me. I was like, oh my gosh, I want to do this. Is it too late? Went back to school. To make a long story short, I had to get all the academic credits that I needed in order to get a psychology degree. Went the PhD route, which is intense, not recommended for all in clinical psychology. And then eventually worked in, this is where we can get into the working with men part. It's like I worked in the Manhattan Veterans Affairs Hospital, which is disproportionately male. Although there are a lot of female veterans as well. But I started working with trauma, what we call moral injury, when you've done things that have transgressed your moral code, and military sexual trauma, and working with a lot of what we might call traditional male clients, and became very, very curious about how to be more effective with them, and thinking about my therapy training experience and like, wow, a lot of this doesn't land with these men who need serious help. And I want to be able to do it. So I had to adjust my clinical approaches. And since then, I've built a clinical practice out of it. I do writing on this topic. And that's what leads me here today with you.
Did you find much overlap between who you worked with at the VA and civilian men?
I would say that the military veteran population tends to come into treatment with just more severe psychological issues than maybe the general population does. I do still see some veterans, but when you're in private clinical practice, you get much more, I don't want to say a range, but you just get a different population, like maybe people who work in industry, business, law. I work with a lot of guys today in my clinical practice who are new to therapy. So it's good to preface our conversation to that. I work with a lot of, I work with couples too. And just going back to the men that I work with, a lot of them have not had great experiences if they did have any touch points with mental health care. And so I see men who are understandably skeptical, if not reluctant, to be in therapy. And I actually really like to work with that population. It wasn't what I had expected, but it's who I see in my private clinical practice.
Well, like you said with your dad, my dad and so many dads out there, you kind of realize later on in their life, they had a ton of feelings, but they didn't always speak about them. So now men are coming to therapy sometimes, and they aren't out blabbing in the public forum about it. What do they come in and say?
Well, it's good that I gave you that background because you have a sense of who I'm working with. What they come in and say is what we might call like the presenting problem or issue. And then where we get to in therapy, which is ideally supposed to get a little bit deeper than that, is much more interesting, right? So they'll come in and they'll, maybe they've been nudged in by someone else, or maybe they're in some bind. They have to make a decision. Should I stay in my marriage? Or some are caught red-handed having done something, someone who's had an affair, for example. But you'll hear words like stress, burnout, low motivation, might have a drinking problem, I don't know, or I have work issues, or my relationship's a mess, right? Those aren't clinical language. They're coming in plain language telling you that they're worn down, confused, disoriented in some way, and they're just at a point where like, I need a map of the terrain ahead. And so that's when, I'm taking what they're presenting as problems, and I'll get to the more specific answer, I promise. They're coming with problems that seem unfixable, right? And they're just like, something in life isn't working. It's poor performance they feel like they're performing poorly in some way without a lot of experience of what is going on within them. And so no one has slowed it down. And psychotherapy ideally goes deeper, and you start to say that, okay, there's this, private sense of being fundamentally sometimes alone and inadequate, with the fear that, oh my God, if I really were to talk about the things that I'm now talking about in therapy, like if anyone were to see that, then I would lose respect, or I wouldn't, be able to receive love. I wouldn't be lovable. Or, and I was just dealing with this today, like if I were to be open, it would blow my whole family up, which is saying that emotional vulnerability is dangerous, right? So that's one of the core beliefs that a lot of men, not all, come in to it.
Can I make sure I heard you right?
Sure.
Emotional, not volatility, but just vulnerability, that's even dangerous.
Yeah, I'm sorry. If I said volatility, I meant vulnerability.
No, you said vulnerability. And that's, which seems like a soft thing. And you hear so many women and children and saying, Dad, please, let me see you. Or friends saying, friend, I care about you. But even that vulnerability, it's not some explosion. It's just softening can feel dangerous.
Yes. It's hard to take off, as we say, that mask. And as a therapist, I have to be very careful because I don't just expect that people are going to do that. I have to earn it, I think of myself. The mental health system has to earn that, meaning that we can't expect men to change and become vulnerable before they come into therapy. It's our job to help them, as one of my, someone who supervised me said, like find success in vulnerability. Because up to that point, they weren't having success in vulnerability, or were too terrified to even go there, or didn't have the skill set to even start that process. And so, like, I think that once you as a therapist recognize the double bind of it all, meaning that, like, okay, I could open up and risk failing big, right? If I take what I learned in therapy and bring it home, or if I try to be vulnerable, or I just shut down and settle for failing safer. And I think failing safer might mean I'm going to wall myself off, or I'm just going to go with anger or grandiosity, or, try to tackle problems with a hammer and nail and solve it. So
I see. And so the men who arrive are kind of at this beach ball moment of you've been holding it down, and finally it pops up, and usually not in a pretty way. And we're going to get into some of the issues every day, and then some maybe more serious mental illness issues. But once they arrive, is there a feeling of hope that things can change? Because if you've constructed your entire life around protection and then suddenly you crack it open, do they have hope?
yes, I think if it's done deftly, and believe me, any therapist you talk to has failed at this and succeeded at this, and I'm one of those therapists. But over the course of time in my career, I feel like I have focused on those first few sessions, even just that initial consult call when you're calling a therapist and seeing if it's a good fit. Like, I take that very seriously. The therapeutic relationship is one of the biggest, if not the biggest, predictor of psychotherapy outcome.
Really?
Meaning that how the bond, the setting of goals in a shared way, and how you're going to achieve those goals, that's all part of the therapeutic alliance. And it's really important in those early stages to get that right, especially with men who might be skeptical.
As far as everyday issues, and I'm going to say every day, but they don't feel every day when it's you, of course. The male loneliness crisis, I've done shows on it, but I see these dueling data sets of some saying this is very serious, some saying men are nothing special when it comes to loneliness. What is your take on that?
I have seen the different data as well. I don't know. I'm not the person to ask if, like, is this a crisis? I think the Surgeon General back in 2023 deemed it a crisis. But I think death by suicide, is any indicator, which I know you've covered on the show, at least to some degree. If that's the most extreme form of loneliness, then it is a male issue. Now, it's hard to connect those two neatly. I think women, struggle with loneliness and social isolation just as much, probably, as men. But I think what makes men susceptible is that they don't always have the same communication skills to drive the meaningful connections that you need to move yourself out of a place of loneliness. And some, even in my practice, might not even use the word loneliness until I get them there, right? I might even say something as simple as, like, reflecting back, like, gosh, like, that strikes me as really lonely. And then they'll be like, well, yeah, like, I guess so. So I can speak to it at the psychological level. It's and define it. It's a painful feeling that you lack meaningful connections, even if you're surrounded by people. And so there are people who are very successful at work. Many people this holiday season will be surrounded by family and seeming joy, and be really lonely. So it's a perceived gap. This is how we define it in psychology: a perceived gap between a desire for connection and the actual experience of it. And so I think that is important, because it's different than being alone. It's different than solitude. And the one thing I did want to point out is that for me, when I think about men, it sometimes feels like alienation is a more fitting word. Not to get into like a semantic thing here, but alienation is like a separation between two things that you think belong together. So you can be alienated from your feelings, from yourself, from your community, from purpose, from meaning in relationships. It's less, maybe it's more of a state of mind. And so the key is that it's subjective, like loneliness, but it's also objective, which means that like men are objectively alienated from relationships when, they don't have close friends. They're disengaged from education and work. You could just look at in the data, loss of factory jobs, let's say, or wage stagnation. Traditional roles that our dads and their dads had are just not there. So you objectively are alienated from what you thought would be there. Do you see what I mean? And so in some ways, it's like as men, and I'm just speaking for myself too, but also the clients that I see, it's like I can sense that, okay, I'm a new dad, and like I thought this is what it would be like, and I'm, alienated from the sense of, being able to come home and not have to do any chores, not change the diaper, and boy, are they in for it.
Yeah, that's going. Yeah, right away. Yeah, because alienation, that word speaks to me of some sort of discordance or disagreement rather than a simple, it's not that you're just removed. It's that there's some sort of a barrier there.
Yes, there is. And it's not like and from that comes loneliness too. And so I think so many men are estranged from meaning and purpose and their feelings, and that's where I was going with it.
Now, maybe on the opposite side of that, there's this viral conversation about man keeping, which I don't know if you've read it, but it says that, girlfriends, wives typically are doing all this emotional labor, and the men rely on them too heavily. Yet, of course, if you say like, he never talks to me, he tells me nothing, that also is not good. So I think a lot of men have bristled at this conversation, and they're trying to figure out when do I lean on somebody? How do I lean on somebody? That seems as like a really tricky one to me, man keeping.
Yes, I've come across that term as well. I could see why men would be offended by it, especially the ones who aren't man kept, right? Like, what do you mean? I mean, I have friends. I go to a therapist. I mean, it's a useful term, and I think it does have some relevance to me as a clinician because I do couples therapy. And man keeping can be like, I see it as women who doing the emotional heavy lifting for their partners, right? Assuming it's a heterosexual relationship in this case, then yes. I would actually be curious: is there a man keeping that goes on in same-sex relationship? Is there one
Not
partner?
in my house.
Well, that's awesome to hear. So
no, I mean, because don't you think? I think. Okay, so we know a lot of women. They are the social and familial ties. That can be exhausting. You're keeping the social calendars. You're saying that someone's birthday. It's all of this. But then there's also the emotional thing between the two partners. So yeah, it's complicated. That's why I just thought you sit in these rooms. I was curious what you thought about it.
Well, yeah, and I think that men need to do better when it comes in heterosexual relationships, especially, to carry the cognitive load, which is planning, organizing, conceiving of what we need to do, planning for it, and then executing on it, right? And then there's the emotional labor that we kind of just touched upon, which is tending to relationships. Are making sure that their, let's say, husband has a shoulder to lean on, or helping them work through tricky, workplace issues that bring up anger or sadness. It's like, that's the man keeping part of it. But I'm interested in that, but also interested in what is the internal experience that men have that they may not be sharing. What load are they carrying in their minds? What does their worry have to say? Because they're not just blank in this. They're not. There's a term that sometimes is used called like privileged obliviousness, right? It's guys are just like, oh, I didn't realize you were doing all this work. No, there's a lot going on upstairs.
Yeah. Well, and I want to get to your article about that, the existential load, in a second. But I do think it occurs sometimes that we're talking about men in this circumstance, that they aren't necessarily eager to learn the skills that their partner is undertaking because they don't want to do it.
Yep.
So,
yes.
That happens.
It's hard. It's there's a lot. You have to slow that down with men and get to what their resistance is in a really non-judgmental way. But that takes some time to do. They will get, a lot of men in marriages who are accused of not doing enough will get defensive at first. So you have to find a way for them to see it. And sometimes I'm blunt. I'm like, she's carrying a lot, and what would it mean if you did take some time off on that day or this day to pick up the kids? And you can kind of walk them into it so they just realize it themselves that the world's different here. Like, she needs you. I think when you, let's say you're a person out there who feels like you're doing all of the cognitive emotional labor, you're the man keeper. If you approach it as like, I need you, like, I think you can be good at this, and like, it's important we share this. This is really difficult for me. Can I get your help? It's almost like very simple. It's like, I'm flailing here, I'm drowning, and like, I really need you here. It's very hard to, could I get your help? Right? It's an invitation as opposed to, you're not enough.
And feeling needed, men will very often respond to something like that. Now, you wrote in Psychology Today, it was about that existential load, the everyday weight men carry, and just the weight of expectations, whether it's external or internal, that they'll provide, they'll be sturdy, they'll be steady, and that has a load of its own. Can you talk about that?
Yes. As I said, I work with couples, and I work with, people who, let's say a woman comes in feeling like, oh my gosh, I'm doing all the work, I'm doing all the man keeping. And then the guy's like, what, wait a minute here. Like, and then they sort of try to sort it out. And she shares the emotional and cognitive burden. And then the guy's kind of stuck, unable to articulate his inner experience in this, and like what he's doing. And, I'll work with a couple, and he'll say, but I'm dealing with all of the finances in the house, right? I know it's kind of stereotypical, but, and what if the whole thing goes under, right? Like, I need to stay at work. And there's this catastrophizing that I saw going on with a lot of it. And some of it was, irrational forecasting financially. And some of it was totally real, right?
So with AI? I mean, people have cause to be concerned.
That's right.
White collar included.
Yes. And so the existential load was just a term that I came up with because financial stress didn't feel like it did what I was seeing justice. This is deeper. And I defined it as a chronic vigilance system that many men, not all, carry about financial provision, and that it fuses this idea fuses identity with earning, meaning I earn, therefore I am. It goes back deeper than just, it goes back to boyhood, but it's not just money stress. It's this radar that's like, constantly scanning out for threats to family survival. And it contaminates presence is one of the other parts of the article that I had in there. So it can look like late night budget checking, comparing yourself to competitors, messaging it in the middle of the night. It's an impossible math problem that's trying to figure out, are we safe? And it's existential, which means that it's a man's sense of being enough, of mattering, of deserving love. All that gets tied to providing. And it's not just mere stress is what I'm saying here.
Well, it seems like also evolutionary. If you're on the savannah and you're the man in charge of your family or clan, you are always monitoring, like you said, constant vigilance to make sure everyone's protected and provided for. And that maybe some of those things that are buried deep inside, maybe they're not based in reality at this moment, but they may be hardwired in some ways. I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, if you talk to an evolutionary biologist, yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's messaged to men in so many different ways. I mean, if I'm working with a young man and they're dating, they're asked more often than not, like, what do you do? As one of the first things, as opposed to where do you live or who are you? And even when you do, let's say, get married, the question from an in-law will become like, how's work? And this isn't even, I'm not even looking at this this isn't about male breadwinners. I work with stay-at-home dads who have to field questions about, well, like insulting questions about like, oh, it's so great of you to, babysit and take this on. And, as if there's some sort of hero, and they don't realize that it's insulting because it's assuming that they're foregoing some sacred duty of financially providing to be a caregiving provider. And so this cuts across, family configuration in terms of who's the breadwinner. And that's why I named it as I did, is that it's for a lot of men.
You don't have to speak to this if you don't want to, but I've noticed that we've touched on it a few times. There are traditional roles, and there are some, when averaging traits or behaviors or predispositions, differences between men and women. Do those come up in the therapy room?
They come up a lot of times when I'm working with individual men. I think therapy becomes a safe space to talk about everything and anything. A lot of guys are really interested in gender differences because they seem to feel it like deep in their bones, but don't always feel like they can talk about it without really stepping in it or coming across as, anti-woman.
Andrew Tate.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. They don't want to fall into that. A lot of guys would not want to fall into the Andrew Tate category. And I try to be as realistic as possible. Yeah, there are people who are working on that as our PhD thesis right now. There's loads of research in the different hard sciences and social sciences that have looked at that. There's just, in terms of mate preferences, I think one of the most robust findings is that, women, when looking for a male, is prioritizing resource acquisition as one of the things that she cares about, along with, kindness. But that's up there. It's not as high up there. It's not in the top 3 or even 5 for men seeking women.
Virility, I'm guessing. I think Scott Galloway, I've heard talk about this. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you co-founded Men's Therapy Hub, MTH, first in Europe, 2026, make the big debut in America. And you wrote in part of the mission statement here, and this is just part of it, build a community that normalizes men taking ownership of their emotional lives with passion and zero reliance on others to do that work for us. That caught my attention because you're saying intentionally, don't expect them to do the work. Yet this many times is a community project, even if it's just 2 people in that community. What's the balance there?
Well, I guess in a way it speaks to the man keeping thing we were saying before. Like
I guess, yeah.
We as men need to build infrastructure to support our well-being. It's not just about talking about it, which is important. It's also building something like Men's Therapy Hub. And so I think
do you want to say what that is?
Yeah, I'll explain it. It's a directory of male therapists for male clients. So we're trying to create community and representation so men feel like they belong in this therapy space, of which about 25% of therapists right now in the US, UK, Canada, Australia are women. And so, there's a disproportionate number of women in this field, and we feel like, why is that? It wasn't always that way. And we wanted to, Chris Hemmings is my co-partner in this. He actually founded it and recruited me for the podcast, which I'll talk about, and also starting the US version of it. But it's the workspace. That's how I sometimes like to think of it. So, yes, there's a directory, but we're trying to create a sense of we're trying to create good health information to put out there about men, and some trainings, and inspire even perhaps a new generation of male therapists to do the work that we love doing so much. So it's a community, and we felt like, gosh, someone has to build it. Mm-hmm. So, he took the initiative, and it's right in line with my values. We'll see how it goes in the US in 2026.
It's a great idea. And so you've done that, and it's going to be transatlantic. And again, you're saying we're going to do this with passion, and the work is ours to do. Is it more about just taking ownership and empowering people? Like, what's the intention behind that phrasing?
Yeah, it's meaning that we can't wait for necessarily government to do it, or in relationships, women who have traditionally done a lot of that care work for men. It's like, no, we're gonna do this. Yeah. And part of it is that it's not that male therapists are better than female. No, it's not that at all. What we're trying to say is, let there be choice out there. When I first started therapy, it was important for me to find a male therapist, someone who had, traversed boyhood socialization, but then later in life, I was like, what? I would like to find a non-male therapist for different reasons. And so just, there ought to be choice. And, I get so many emails from people saying, oh, do you know of a male therapist? Or, if you're unavailable, like, where can I find one? And it's really hard. It's like a wilderness out there on these directories to try to find someone who's a good fit. And so we kind of wanted to cut through the clutter, and, we vet the folks on the site, and it's not meant to be exclusionary. It's meant to be a community that hopefully will help a lot of men out there.
I've had several friends over the past few years, just in different life stages and situations, that they have looked for male therapists and thought, well, what do I do now? Because there aren't any good ones here, and we don't know. And like you said, it flipped entirely. It used to be male dominated in this field, and now males are a not small minority. It's insignificant. 25% is not much.
Yeah. Yes. And we've my partner in crime here, Chris Hemmings. We started our own podcast called No Man's an Island, and we talk a lot about that as well. So I thought I'd throw that out there.
Please we should all listen to it. We should. And who do you have on? Or do you guys just talk, or how's it work?
we have on guests. So I think actually Zach Seidler was just on, coming out this week. We have researchers. We have a sociologist named Brendan Hartman. He has a presence online as a Remasculine, and it was a great interview, and talked to other psychologists and mental health advocates. So we're early on here, but
great. Hey, I love to see that going. One thing I did want to ask you about, that it may seem off topic, but I guess I don't really think it is. Family can be such a wonderful input in life. It really is the foundation of life. And we see men who are married, that they are healthier, they live longer, they're more civically engaged, they're happier. Yet family formation is plummeting, specifically among the working class. What effect do you see of family formation going down so precipitously? And do you find any cause for optimism there?
Optimism? No. I mean, maybe I should be. I don't know. But yes, I think that there's more choice all around. I'm drawing on what I see in my clinical work, that as, women don't need marriage for, for economic dependence, right? They don't need to be, they don't need to be economically dependent in a marriage. The institution doesn't serve that as much as you become more empowered financially. Also, there's a choice. Birth control, you can freeze your eggs, you can adopt. There's so many other ways to start a family, and so maybe it's getting pushed out a little bit more. For a lot of people, it's daunting. I mean, you're a parent, I'm a parent. It's really hard work, and there's a lot of great think pieces out there about being the ideal parent and the ideal professional, and just the weight that you carry doing all of it is
good luck.
Yeah, it's who sees that and is let me get some of that. So, I mean, there's a lot of there's such a confluence of social and economic reasons why family formation is down. But yeah, I think that
a complicating factor. Can I add just one complicating factor there? I was reading Ross Douthat, New York Times, and this is one of his hobby horses. College-educated women, which they now make up a bigger share of college-educated people in America as the generations go on, earning more, things like that, which is all positive. But it is the wealthier, higher educated people who are still getting married. The people who are more working class, their marriage rates and divorce rates, not in the direction you want, yet they're the ones who are struggling the most many times. And I just look at society and think, if you want to really help people, having a cohesive, healthy family, that could be one of the best things we could possibly do in the world. I don't know.
I would agree. And maybe that's a bias of mine, having done this and having started a family. But you're right. And I'm glad you point out the working class piece, because a lot of the issues facing boys and men become more significant when you stratify it by socioeconomic status. And so I'm for it. And I think that there are families you're born into, and then there are families of choice. And so if, the social infrastructure out there doesn't support you building families of choice, right? If there's a drop in, church participation or civic engagement, then it's okay, which goes back to the loneliness piece, because then it's more people are retreating to solitude. And in solitude, it's not so pleasant and peaceful there.
No,
right?
Bowling alone, that whole phenomenon, not good. Now, some of this is more serious, Jett, and I'm sure you see this in your practice. And mental health challenges can be really profound for some folks. Let me just read the SAMHSA data from 2022 here in the US. Serious mental illness in the past year. Women, 7% experienced that. Men, about 5%. Got treatment for their SMI. 71% of women, 59% of men. So it seems like men, even when this is a profound issue, are less likely to get help. Is that right? So what are the most common challenges when it comes to serious mental illness?
Well, I think more men, the stigma is breaking. More men are seeking help, right? The number's lower than women, you said there, but more men are seeking help. And I think with serious mental illness and with less serious, the question is what happens when they get through the door of the mental health provider, which is what I'm very interested in, and how we can make therapy work for men and help them with their problems and not cast them as problems. And so I think there isn't a lot of research, although Zach Saller's doing and his team are doing a great job of it, of trying to make these mental health experiences male friendly. So when someone does walk in the door for the first time, it is a gateway experience that, taking care of myself mentally is possible. It brings me hope, right?
Yeah.
You brought up the idea of hope later. Yes, that's what we're looking for. And so the way you create hope is you build a trusting relationship. You understand the different relational styles that men might come in with. A lot of times that could mean, changing the format of therapy. So it's walk and talk, or in a group, not necessarily facing each other, opening with some banter, keeping things looser before you go deeper. In my work with men, and especially with severe or serious mental illness, is you have to front load clarity on what therapy is, right? We can't just expect that men are going to walk in and have buy-in for therapy, right? A lot of socialization for men isn't that, inherent to the experience of talking up to another person. There's no what's the inherent value to just sharing your feelings with someone? We as therapists have to offer them what the positive outcomes of that could be, and why it's important, and why I'm asking you this question, and where I think we can go, and why I've given you this diagnosis, and what it means and what it doesn't mean. So it's give them a map of what the hell is going to happen when I walk into this alien experience of sitting across from someone face to face when I'm dealing with severe depression or, anxiety or psychosis, so that's a big issue. And, there being enough providers out there who are willing to work, I think, with severe mental illness too, because it's very, very hard. It's very difficult work. And you see it mostly, I would say, in hospital settings rather than where I work clinical practice.
I see. But it's amazing that you're saying you do have to tailor that, whether it's walking. I never heard of walking. Instead of talk therapy, walk therapy. That's
walk and talk.
Very smart.
It's becoming a thing. Yeah.
Really? Aaron Sorkin on The West Wing was onto something. They did walk and talks all day long. And then the idea also of telling them practically how this will help, because, this isn't sales, but the number one thing you always want to tell someone is not the feature of something, but the benefit. What is in it for you? And men many times are practical, what do I get out of this? And I have to give you all this money too, that they want to know, what do they get?
Yes. The expense piece is certainly, an inhibiting factor with therapy and access.
As far as barriers, Zach Seidler, now with Movember, excellent researcher and thought leader. 2019, he put this out along with a team, men with self-reported mental concerns who did not get therapy. 65% of those men wanted therapy, 35% did not. 80% believe that people just feel down sometimes, even though these people were depressed. 80% don't know what to look for in a therapist, these men. 73% think you should solve your problems on your own. And so seems like you and your co-founder are trying to solve some of those problems too, to say, okay, once you've identified there is an issue and that you do want some help, that you can find the appropriate help. And a lot of men, they do want to speak to a man because they might be having problems relating to women, or they might just feel out of place and just feel like this guy gets me or might sympathize with me in some way. And we've seen that phenomenon in schools too. Male teachers, they are harder on their male students, but they also expect more out of them and they get more out of them. And so it's an interesting dynamic of why some men are not pursuing therapy, even though they know they kind of need it.
Yes, there's there's a sense of I need to have a really big problem in order to go to therapy. A lot of times in the first session, a person will come in and say, is this really worth, do you think I need therapy? Is it okay that I even do therapy with you? I feel do I belong? They're asking me. And then in some way I tell them, hell yeah, you belong. That's a very good reason for wanting to come in to talk to somebody. And I'm glad that you did. And here's what it could look like if we worked together. And, just speaking in a plain English way like that, can get you pretty far, because they don't want to be made to feel alien. They want to they want to be able to maintain their dignity in the room. And I think when you just explain the process like that, and that's a big part of this piece.
All right, Jett. So let's say people are listening and thinking, okay, maybe that is for me. Maybe I do belong there, or there is some value for me there. It's not that I'm going to be laying on a couch for the next 15 years. This might be for the next 5 weeks or something. What do you say to the people who are thinking, maybe?
Well, then they have some buy-in, right? So you're in a good spot. And I would say to them is give it a few sessions, 3, 4, 5, 6, and a therapist should ask you how things are going after a while. But after 1 or 2, and you just don't get that sense, that guttural sense that this is a good match, it's okay to quit, right? And don't ghost. Send them a message and say, this isn't working, and that's all right. We as therapists know that, that we're not going to be the perfect match for everyone. But see it through. That's what I would say. Like the process of doing this work, it's worth finding the right fit for you. And that like, don't give up on it. And, one of the great things about seeing a therapist is that you can also challenge them, that, you can express your dissatisfaction. That's part of the work, especially in psychodynamic work, is we as therapists will use the therapeutic relationship itself as a sign of how things are going and how they might fare out there in the real world. And like how people relate in session is reflective of how they relate out of session. And so, your therapist should be curious about that, right? Noticing things in the session. That's a good sign that you've found someone who's a good fit as well. It's not all about skills and, anxiety management and dealing with stress. And it's also about using what goes on in the therapy room as data for what goes on outside of the therapy room. And so stick with it. The process it's difficult. It goes through its ups and downs, and, but it's worth it. It's different than just talking to friends or, chatting at the barbershop or in the locker room, wherever you are. This is a different experience, and it's unique because a therapist isn't your friend. A therapist isn't your, even your coach or family figure. It's what, one person told me recently is like, oh my gosh, like I've never told someone that before. And it's so de-shaming when you can find your voice across from someone else to say things you never have said before and put the puzzle pieces together with someone else. So it's gonna be really powerful. And I don't know if, I'm not out there saying everyone should do it, but that's my pitch.
I think it's going to have a high success rate. And I think it is just terrific that you're connecting people with MTH, especially men who are looking for a little bit of help, a little connection.
Well,
Jett Stone, I'll be listening to No Man's an Island. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. It was a lot of fun to be on here.
If you want to follow the progress they're making with MTH, it's menstherapyhub.com. Fantastic resource. If you want to listen to or read what Jett's putting out, jetstonephd.com. Thanks for being here for this conversation. I hope it was practical and really helpful, but also hopeful about where we can all go, especially when we partner with other people. I'm Chance Seals. Thank you for joining me here on All Boy. We are on Spotify and Apple with the podcast. Also, don't forget Substack. I put out the podcast, but also my weekly essays there about what's happening in my life and home and brain. If you want to be subjected to that, it's all there for free and you can follow along. It's good to have you as a fellow traveler on this journey. Thanks for being here. See you soon.